Oh, listen, my next guest is a CFACT senior policy analyst, a gifted scholar who's researched and written extensively on global warming policy with a particular emphasis on property rights and rural America. I want to welcome from the National Center for Public Policy Research, Bonner Cohen. Bonner, so good to have you. Thanks for being here.
Well, Pastor Rick, it's great to be here as always.
Thank you so much. Well, okay, so let's jump into this. New Green Deal. This is kind of like a rehashing of the same old tired policy efforts that we saw the last 8 years out of Obama's EPA, and consistently coming from the left. But let's kind of really peel it back and expose it for what it really is. What are some of the most significant scientific weaknesses, if you will, that you can talk to us about?
Well, the underlying assumption of both the Green New Deal and the entire discussion of man-made global warming, which is what the Green New Deal in most part is supposed to combat, is the belief that man-made greenhouse gases produced through the burning of fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas are warming the planet, and doing so to such an extent that this will pose an existential threat to both planet Earth as well as the people who live on it. As quote-unquote proof for all of this, various things are cited, such as rising sea levels, hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, droughts, and all of those things. The problem with all of that is that there's absolutely zero evidence to back any of it up. Yes, the Earth has warmed up about 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit over the course of the last roughly 250 years. What people do not tell you is that slight warming came after 400 years, or more like actually 450 years or so, of a cooling, something called the Little Ice Age, which itself came after a period of warmth that was much warmer, that was in the Middle Ages, than what we are experiencing today. So you get the pattern. The Earth warms, the Earth cools. There are sometimes, certain areas are subjected to droughts, come back a few hundred years later, and that area will be flooded because things change in nature. What these people cannot explain is why there has actually been no increase in the number or intensity of hurricanes. Yes, when they hit, they are horrible things, but they have always hit. Sometimes they come in bunches. Sometimes we'll get lucky and we'll dodge the bullets of hurricanes for several years, but sooner or later, given the fact that the United States, particularly the southeastern United States, is in a hurricane-prone zone and has always been in a hurricane-prone zone, then these things are going to happen. There is an interesting actual reduction in the number of tornadoes, despite what we may have heard. We don't know why that happened. Maybe it's just nothing but pure chance. But the point of all of this is that everything that these people point to as quote-unquote proof of climate change, which they used to refer to as global warming, these are things that have been going on since time immemorial. Yes, the seas are rising, but they have been doing so since the end of the last ice age. And
Sure.
actually, the amount of sea level rise is less now than it was a few hundred years ago.
Well,
So go ahead.
well, I was going to say too, and this is something that's very rarely discussed, but the carbon imprint that they talk about is actually greater from the ocean surface, as I understand it, according to scientist Tom Harris that I had on from the
Cohen, good man.
yeah, he came on and talked about that the carbon imprint is greater from the ocean surface than anything they can attribute to mankind.
That's right. Sometimes, if you look at the environmentalist propaganda, you have the impression that the Earth is this very benign force, and it is man, the evildoer, who is screwing things up. Well, the Earth gives us things like volcanoes, undersea venting,
Yeah,
which can explain an awful lot about currents that come and go, and sometimes bring warm water, sometimes bring cold water. That explains why the Arctic ice, for instance, up the North Pole, sometimes it really does contract. But after a while, it also comes back. It expands and contracts.
gotcha.
And this scientists have attributed to something called the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, which means that warm undersea currents shoot up from the Pacific Ocean up to the North Pole for reasons, quite frankly, we don't understand. Then that ceases, and when that ceases, the ice expands.
Uh,
Um, SUVs have nothing to do with it.
right.
So, and in that case, it's not the air that's getting warmer or cooler, it's the water doing so for its own reasons.
Well, and then to some degree, we need carbon, as it were, in order to feed the plants, which then convert that and change it into oxygen. Or am I
Oh,
correct in
that's
that?
absolutely right. In fact, I could think of something, I can think of nothing that would be more criminal, and I mean that in the literal sense of the word,
Right.
than restricting levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Because as you correctly pointed out, and most people should have learned in high school, carbon dioxide is plant food. It fertilizes plant. It is absolutely essential for human life. Over the course of the past, 300, 400 years or so, since the end of the Little Ice Age, global levels of carbon dioxide have risen from about 250 parts per million to around 400 parts per million, and that is a very beneficial thing because the Earth, as a result thereof, is undergoing a greening. We have more trees on the Earth than we had 300, 400 years ago. Areas of the Earth, including parts of North Africa, are now being transformed from a desert back to what they were before the desert came along,
Sure.
which is a greenish kind of marshy area. It's a remarkable thing to look at. But if one goes to the NOAA and NASA websites, and you can look at and compare photographs of the Earth taken from satellites, the Earth now and the Earth 50 years ago. Bingo, it's greener. And that's a good thing, and that is largely attributable to rising levels of carbon dioxide. We have a lot of people to feed in the world, and sadly, there are parts of the world, sub-Saharan Africa and the Indian subcontinent come to mind, where you have a lot of hungry people. These people have to be fed. And one of the ways we can feed them is raising agricultural productivity. And
Mm-hmm.
one of the best ways of raising agricultural productivity is to make sure that there are ample levels of carbon dioxide in the air that will enable crops to grow.
And obviously, a larger greenhouse effect, which they want to say is this is a terrible thing.
That's right.
Okay, but how many of us who don't have a green thumb, right? Are invest in you know special tubs where we can grow our produce and special greenhouses. Hello. that we build over these tubs in order to create a consistent environment which encourages the growth so we can have more production, so we don't have to go to the grocery store. We can start to grow organically and things of that nature. And what do we want? We want a greenhouse in order to be able to do that. And what you've just described, Warner, is the greenhouse effect that is benefiting these areas. And you know what it really speaks to me is the underlying lie that the left doesn't want anyone to know, Bonner, and that is what they're really after is population control. And they have to starve the food supplies in order for there to be population control, eliminate petroleum products, which are the cheapest and cleanest way for us to be able to produce energy at a cost-effective way that allows for people to be able to afford it, people especially in third world countries that struggle economically. Wow, what a scheme. They're playing on us.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. The modern environmental movement is an outgrowth of an earlier movement called eugenics. Eugenics was all the rage with the chattering classes 150 years ago. Beginning in Europe and also in the United States. One of its biggest supporters was one Woodrow Wilson. Eugenics then fell out of favor when it was very enthusiastically embraced by the Nazis, and therefore out went the word eugenics, and in came the somewhat more gentlemanly word of population control, because we were told that we had a population bomb, and there was going to be a population explosion, and that we needed to limit, to use a polite term, the number of people on the earth. And the modern environmental movement grew out of all of that. And ultimately, what you see here are people citing something like climate change, which they originally called global warming, using that as a pretext for an agenda which has absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with the climate and never did. An agenda that will put an enormous amount of power into the hands of very few self-anointed global elites, and by the way, in so doing, put an awful lot of money into the pockets of purveyors of alternative energy, solar power, wind power, and the like, and to create a rigged game that is specifically designed to serve the desires of the global elites at the expense of ordinary people, both in the United States, in Europe, in Japan, and what have you, but most tragically in the third world, where don't even have access to running water or electricity.
Well, and here's the sad thing. When you ask them what happens to the unserved population, they'll tell you they die. And their justification, so that the greater good is served.
That's right. Anyone who thinks that people in Africa and in India and elsewhere out in the countryside are just waiting eagerly for the day they can be served by wind turbines and solar panels. No. These people would like to have the same level of reliability when it comes to energy that we here have come to take for granted. And the environmental movement, which would have you believe that they are morally upstanding people, is actually engaged in policies that will keep these people chained to poverty from now until kingdom come.
Right.
And they do so with not any guilty conscience whatsoever.
Left-wing policies kill the creativity that is what allows us to be able to meet these needs. And ask those who are starving to death, Do they see their lives as any less valuable? Can we as believers see their? It's so funny. Well, it's not funny, but it is in a way. And bear with me as I say this. They whine and complain about separating families at our southern border of illegal immigrants that are crossing into our country, and they've created another humanitarian crisis, which is a whole nother story at that border because of the policies that the leftists have put in and the globalists have put in. And yet, very little do they say about those in the sub-Saharans, as you're talking about. And James Robeson, the minister, has a tremendous outreach. A number of people do. But very little do they say about those individuals who are starving to death, those in India that are starving to death, and so on. Why? Because of left-wing policies around the world.
Yes, and every place they have been implemented, from Venezuela, which is our current example, to Mao Zedong's China, to Lenin and Stalin's Soviet Union, and to all the wannabe Marxists who made a complete mess out of post-colonial Africa. You look at all of these things and look at the human tragedy, the loss of life that took place there, all brought to you courtesy of the left, the very same people who are now trying to impose the Green New Deal on us. And the interesting thing about this is they walk away from these things. They turn their back on them as if absolutely nothing had happened. There's no guilty conscience. There's no recognition that something that went disastrously wrong before isn't going to go disastrously wrong again. And believe me, it will.
Well, history has a way of repeating itself, doesn't it, Bonner?
Yeah, yes, particularly those who absolutely refuse to learn anything from history. Some of our listeners may remember about 20 years ago, Al Gore said that combating climate change would have to become the organizing principle of society. And it would thus lead to a dramatic wrenching of society. Well, that's actually at the core of the Green New Deal. We are to eliminate fossil fuels by the year 2030. Absolutely impossible. And any attempt to get from here to there will end in absolute disaster. We are to retrofit millions and millions of buildings and homes in this country to make them climate resistant. A gigantic waste of money. We are supposed to do away even with as much air travel as possible, so that people will be forced to put into trains. Obviously, it wouldn't be the bullet train in California because that's
10 years
because nobody can afford it.
Yeah.
You go down to one absolutely harebrained scheme after the other. All of these things are completely divorced from reality, but they're all eagerly embraced by people who will tell you with a straight face that this needs to be done because it's a good thing. Well, it's not a good thing. It's a very bad thing.
Well, here's Al Gore trying to recorrect his statement. Here we go.
10 years ago, when the movie An Inconvenient Truth came out, the single most criticized scene in that movie was an animated scene showing that the combination of sea level rise and storm surge would put the ocean water into the 9/11 memorial site, which was then under construction. And people said, that's ridiculous. What a terrible exaggeration.
There is a wake-up call here, and that is climate change and our vulnerability to it. It was true 10 years ago, it was true 5 years ago, it is undeniable today.
Now, of course, what they show you is they show you the floodwaters from Superstorm Sandy. and they claim that those floodwaters are a vindication of his concept of melting ice caps and so forth. Speak to that if you would, real quick.
Yes, because Gore originally said that these rising sea levels would come as a result of melting ice caps from the North Pole. There was flooding in New York in the wake of Superstorm Sandy in the fall of 2012, but that had nothing whatsoever to do with melting ice caps, nor was that anything really new to New York City. The worst hurricane to hit New York City and Long Island occurred in 1938. It was called the Long Island Express. It killed over 600 people until it finally wore itself out after going north into Quebec. That was at a time of practically no man-made greenhouse gases. So the cause of that particular hurricane was something else. And ever since New York City, originally New Amsterdam, was created in 1630, the area has been hit by numerous hurricanes and tropical storms. They're not as frequent there as they are further south, but they do occur. Gore was not vindicated by Superstorm Sandy at all, because he tried to fool his viewers into believing that the flooding that they were seeing in the lower part of Manhattan was due to the melting of ice caps, when it had absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with that.
And if you go to nsidc.org/Greenland-today, you can see that the Greenland ice sheet of today is no different than the Greenland ice sheet of the days that Gore was talking about, claiming that there was going to be a massive melt. Guess what? It hasn't happened. Bonner Cohen has been our guest. National Center for Policy Research, nationalcenter.org is the website, nationalcenter.org. Bonner, as always, thanks so much for being with us and enlightening us. And I am looking forward to our interview in person next week or later.
Next Friday.
Next Friday.
I'm looking forward to it, too.
Yep, we'll be together live next Friday at CPAC, and I look forward to talking with you then. God bless you, sir, and thanks for all that you do for our republic.